Mayberry looked perfect on screen. White picket fences, porch swings, and the kind of neighbor everyone wants. Behind those smiles, something else was happening. Quiet tensions, clipped rehearsals, and a single castmate who quietly drove a wedge through the set. It wasn't gossip. It was a slow, steady coldness that changed how people worked together. But what split them apart would surprise you. Mayberry's public face versus private truth. When the Andy Griffith Show premiered on October 3, 1960, it didn't just launch another sitcom, it created a world people wanted to live in. Mayberry wasn't just a town on television, it was comfort itself. A place where the front porch light was always on, neighbors waved as they passed, and the worst trouble you'd face might be a runaway chicken. At the heart of it was Andy Griffith, calm, kind, endlessly patient. His small-town sheriff reminded Americans of what they felt they were losing: simplicity, decency, and peace. It was the early 1960s after all. The world outside was changing fast. Civil rights protests, politics, and cultural shifts filled the headlines. But in Mayberry, none of that existed. There, life moved at a slower rhythm, almost frozen in time. The show ran for 8 seasons and 249 episodes, shot first in black and white, later in color. It never dropped out of the top 10 in Nielsen ratings and ended its final season at number 1, something only a few shows in history ever did. For millions of viewers, those 30 minutes each week were a reminder that goodness still mattered. But behind that easy rhythm, the set was far less peaceful. The cast worked long hours, rehearsing, shooting, reshooting. The tone may have been calm, but the schedule wasn't. Every smile you saw had been practiced, polished, perfected, and though the chemistry looked effortless, it often came from repetition, not friendship. Andy Griffith was a natural leader, but he was also human. He carried the stress of holding a hit show together. Don Knotts, his right-hand man on screen, worried constantly about living up to expectations. And Frances Bavier, who played the beloved Aunt Bee, had her own strict sense of professionalism that didn't always blend with the easygoing Southern charm around her. Ron Howard, little Opie, was the youngest on set, but even he could sense it. Later in life, he said he always felt safe, yet he could tell when the adults weren't getting along. For a child who grew up believing in the magic of television, that realization was a quiet education. That harmony on screen doesn't always survive once the cameras stop. Still, the magic worked. Because when those lights came on and the theme song played, Mayberry was perfect again. Audiences didn't see the fatigue. They didn't sense the tension. All they saw was a man and his son walking hand in hand toward the fishing hole, the symbol of a world that felt like home. That's the strange thing about the Andy Griffith Show. It sold peace, but it was built on pressure. It promised simplicity, but it demanded perfection. It showed family, even when that family sometimes couldn't stand each other. And yet, maybe that's exactly why it worked. Because even behind the calmest smiles, people are complicated. And in a way, that made Mayberry more real than anyone realized. Because in Mayberry, peace wasn't just a theme. It was a performance. And like any great performance, it came with a cost. Ron Howard, the boy behind Mayberry. Before he was one of Hollywood's most trusted directors, Ron Howard was simply Opie, a freckled, red-haired boy with a soft voice and eyes that seemed to hold every ounce of Mayberry's innocence. But even then, he wasn't just acting. He was observing, learning, taking mental notes on how people worked, argued, and hid their real emotions behind smiles. Born on March 1, 1954, in Duncan, Oklahoma, Ron came from a show business family. His father, Rance Howard, was an actor and writer. His mother, Jean, was an actress too. Performing wasn't a dream for Ron, it was daily life. By age 5, he'd already appeared in The Twilight Zone, Dennis the Menace, and a handful of other shows. But when he landed the role of Opie Taylor, everything changed. He became the nation's favorite son, a symbol of honesty and heart. Yet behind those wholesome scenes, Ron was just a child learning to navigate adult worlds. He remembered filming one episode, The Pickle Story, where Opie had to eat jar after jar of Aunt Bee's terrible homemade pickles. What the audience didn't know was that Ron hated pickles. Every take was pure torture, but he smiled through it because that's what professionals did. Even at 6 years old, he understood the quiet pressure of making something look easy. That mix of warmth and restraint followed him through life. After the Andy Griffith Show, Ron stepped into Happy Days, another role that made him a household name. But even then, he wasn't content to stay in front of the camera. The lessons he learned on that old Mayberry set, patience, observation, and empathy, would later guide him behind the camera. Because before Ron Howard ever directed a single scene, he had already lived through one, the carefully staged calm of a town where not everything was as simple as it seemed. Aunt Bee, the beloved and the isolate. To millions of viewers, Aunt Bee was the soul of Mayberry, warm, nurturing, and endlessly patient. She was the kind of aunt everyone wished they had, baking pies, fussing over family, and keeping the home stitched together with love and tradition. But Frances Bavier, the woman behind that gentle smile, couldn't have been more different from her character. Off camera, she was private, particular, and deeply serious about her craft. Colleagues described her as a perfectionist, polite, but distant. She wasn't cruel, she was cautious. While Andy Griffith loved to laugh and keep the atmosphere light between takes, Frances preferred quiet and focus. She didn't mingle much, rarely joined in the jokes, and kept her dressing room door shut. To some, that silence felt cold. To others, it was simply her way of protecting the work. She treated acting like a calling, not a playground. If a director asked her to move an inch, she'd question why. If a line felt wrong, she said so. That discipline gave Aunt Bee her emotional depth, and gave the crew a headache more than once. But the biggest clash wasn't about lines or lighting, it was about personality. Andy and Frances respected each other as professionals, but they never found common ground beyond that. He was easygoing and social. She was rigid and private. Their differences didn't explode. They simmered quietly, like tension waiting for a reason to surface. Still, Frances Bavier delivered one of television's most enduring performances. Week after week, she made the world believe in Aunt Bee's kindness, even when she struggled to show it herself. And as time went on, that gap between the woman and her character grew wider until the warmth that filled America's living rooms started to fade behind the camera. Because sometimes, the people who play the kindest characters are the ones fighting the hardest to find that kindness in real life. The Griffith-Bavier Rift. Andy Griffith and Frances Bavier were the heart of the Andy Griffith Show. At least, that's how it looked on screen. Sheriff Taylor and Aunt Bee felt inseparable, their bond as warm and natural as family. But when the cameras stopped, that connection quietly fractured. What looked like affection was, in truth, formality, a professional partnership held together by duty, not closeness. Their rift didn't begin with one big argument. It grew slowly, scene by scene, year by year. Andy liked things loose, funny, and easygoing. Frances liked precision. Every detail mattered, from a line's tone to the placement of a teacup. And when those two worlds met, sparks flew, quietly. Andy, ever the Southern gentleman, tried to smooth things over, but Frances' guarded nature made that almost impossible. She kept her distance. He eventually stopped trying. Still, Andy never spoke harshly of her. He understood she came from a generation of actors who believed professionalism meant formality. But it hurt him that they couldn't share the same warmth off-screen that they performed so effortlessly on it. Years later, long after the show ended, Andy decided to do something about it. He drove to her home in North Carolina, hoping to reconcile. He wanted to close that chapter kindly, the way his on-screen character might have. It didn't go well. Frances didn't welcome the surprise visit. To her, the gesture crossed a line. The door that opened slightly soon closed again, leaving their differences unresolved. For years after that, they never spoke. But life has a way of softening sharp edges. Near the end of her life, Frances fell ill. Alone and reflective, she picked up the phone and called Andy. This time, she was ready to speak from the heart. She apologized, not as Aunt Bee, not as an actress, but as herself. "I'm sorry we didn't get along better," she said. "It was my fault." Andy later said that phone call meant everything. He forgave her instantly. Two people who had spent years pretending to be family finally were, even if only for a few minutes. When Frances passed away in 1989, Andy remembered her not for the tension, but for her talent. He once said she made Aunt Bee real and that without her, Mayberry wouldn't have worked. Their story wasn't perfect, but it was human. Proof that even the sweetest shows can hide untold bitterness and that forgiveness sometimes comes right at the curtain call. How those early tensions echoed later. Ron Howard was just a kid when he watched grown-ups wrestle with pride, distance, and quiet resentment on the Andy Griffith set. But even as a child, he noticed things. The cold smiles, the polite silences, the way people said one thing on camera and meant something else off it. He learned early that harmony can be rehearsed, and that people can love a story without loving the people inside it. That lesson followed him for life. When Happy Days ended and Ron stepped behind the camera, he carried Mayberry's unspoken truth with him. That authenticity is fragile. It's something you protect, not perform. He directed with empathy, patience, and an almost obsessive focus on keeping tension off the set, maybe because he'd already seen what tension could do. Then came A Beautiful Mind. It won Oscars, global praise, and turned Ron into one of Hollywood's most respected directors. But it also brought criticism. Some accused him of softening the truth, of leaving out the messy parts of mathematician John Nash's life. For Ron, that criticism cut deep. He wasn't trying to hide flaws, he was trying to tell the heart of the story. The backlash reminded him of something he'd learned decades earlier. People will always see the version of truth they want to see. Years later, he faced that lesson again, this time not in film, but in real life. In 2020, Ron directed Hillbilly Elegy, a movie based on J.D. Vance's memoir. Back then, Vance wasn't a politician, just a man telling his story about survival and identity. Ron saw humanity in that. But as years passed and Vance entered politics, his public views changed sharply, and fans began linking the film to those beliefs. Ron stayed calm, as always, but when asked, he admitted he was surprised and disappointed by the transformation. He didn't lash out, he didn't rant, but people close to him said it felt personal. Maybe it reminded him of Mayberry, of how someone you thought you understood could become a stranger once the camera stopped rolling. He once said that directing is about trust, trusting actors, trusting truth, trusting that people mean what they say. And when that trust breaks, the disappointment feels heavier than anger. Because it isn't just about disagreement, it's about realizing that sometimes the stories we tell together aren't the same stories we live afterward. That's a lesson Ron learned at 6 years old, standing in front of a camera, smiling through a scene he didn't love. A lesson that still echoes through his career, that behind every calm smile, there's always a story you don't see. The complicated legacy. The Andy Griffith Show will always live in that perfect corner of television history, a place where kindness triumphed, neighbors cared, and every problem could be solved before the credits rolled. But the truth behind Mayberry was never that simple. It was a story of people, flawed, proud, brilliant people, trying to create something pure, even when their own lives were far from it. Andy Griffith and Frances Bavier never shared the kind of friendship their characters had, but they still made millions believe it was real. Ron Howard never forgot the quiet lessons he learned between those wooden fences, that smiles can hide tension, that grace takes effort, and that forgiveness sometimes arrives too late. Yet somehow, those imperfections made the show even more meaningful. Because Mayberry wasn't just about perfection, it was about people trying to reach it. And maybe that's why the show still feels timeless. We all want to believe in a world where disagreements end with understanding, where people grow, and where even the coldest hearts can soften with time. When Frances called Andy to apologize, it didn't erase the past, but it showed that even the most fractured relationships can find closure. When Ron became a filmmaker who valued truth over spectacle, it showed that lessons learned in silence can shape entire careers. And when Andy Griffith passed away years later, buried on the same North Carolina island he called home, his fans didn't remember the tensions or the feuds. They remembered the laughter, the peace, the feeling that for 30 minutes every week, the world made sense. The story of Mayberry isn't just about nostalgia. It's about growth, grace, and how the people who brought us simple living were living anything but simple lives themselves. Yet that's the beauty of it. Out of all their flaws came something lasting, something human. Because even in a make-believe town, real hearts were learning real lessons. And that's why Mayberry, for all its myths, will never fade away.